Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're not really doing our usual routine.
No, not at all.
Yeah, we aren't analyzing a best-selling book or looking at some highly polished investigative report from a major newspaper. And we certainly aren't breaking down a slick streaming documentary. We're wading into something much, much rawer today.
I mean, raw is probably the understatement of the year for this material.
It really is. What we are looking at is a stack of unedited, chaotic, and frankly terrifying audio transcripts and text messages. And these were recorded just last month, July 19th and 20th. 2025.
Right, so very recent.
Exactly. This is a real-time unfolding conversation between a researcher named Lowell Boulding, who is operating out of Victoria, British Columbia, and a man named William Sasha Riley.
And for you listening, Riley is the witness here. He is the survivor. He's the source of this entire narrative that we are about to try and deconstruct for you.
But before we even take the first step into that narrative, I want to be crystal clear about our mission on this deep dive. We are not a court of law. We are not a jury.
Right, that is so important to establish up front.
Our job today is solely to analyze the testimony of a man who is currently preparing, like right now as we speak, for potential testimony at the International Criminal Court. We are going to sift through his memories to construct the timeline he is presenting. And we need to note that these memories are nonlinear and deeply, deeply traumatic.
Yeah, and we have to issue the strongest possible disclaimer we have ever had on this show. The content we are discussing today involves extreme graphic violence.
Very extreme.
We are talking about the severe sexual assault of children. We are talking about torture. And we are talking about very heavy, very specific allegations against some of the most prominent political figures in the United States.
It is an incredibly heavy topic. It is disturbing on every conceivable level.
And because of that, we are reporting strictly on what is contained in the source text, nothing more. We are looking for internal consistency. We are looking for specific details that might be verifiable. And we are analyzing the structure of the trafficking ring that Riley describes.
Exactly. We are not endorsing these claims as proven facts. We are taking no political sides whatsoever. Our goal is simply to treat the source material with the absolute seriousness it demands and report to you what is in it.
Okay, so let's start with the man himself, who is William Sasha Riley. Because if you don't understand the witness, you really can't understand the testimony.
Right, so in the transcripts, he introduces himself with a dual identity. He was actually born Manuel Sasha Barlos, but his legal name, the name on his driver's license and his military records, is William Sasha Riley.
And that military record is totally crucial to this whole thing.
Why is that so central to how he presents his identity?
Well, for one thing, it establishes that he is a disciplined observer. He served 2 distinct stints in the U.S. Army. He was in from 1991 to 1998, and then he went back in from 2002 to 2016. I mean, that is a career soldier.
That covers a huge amount of ground. You've got the Gulf War era and the War on Terror era.
Exactly. And in the chat logs with Boulding, Riley actually uploads a copy of his DD-214.
Let's pause there for a second, because for listeners who maybe haven't served or just aren't familiar with military bureaucracy, what exactly is a DD-214?
It's the Certificate of Release or Discharge from Active Duty. In the military world, it is the holy grail of paperwork.
It proves you were there.
Right. It lists your dates of service, your rank, your awards, any deployments, and the nature of your discharge. By providing this to the researcher, Riley is effectively saying, I am who I say I am. He isn't just some anonymous guy in a forum. He is a verified veteran with a solid paper trail.
But the story he is telling Boulding, the reason they are talking, isn't about his time in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's about his childhood.
Right. He describes himself as a survivor of a high-level human trafficking ring. But unlike the typical stories where a child is, kidnapped by strangers in a van, Riley claims he was trafficked by the very people who were supposed to protect him, his adoptive parents.
And this is where we really need to start building out the structure of this alleged ring. Because usually when people imagine these things, they picture a shabby, faceless organization. But Riley puts a face on it immediately.
He does. He starts right at home with his adoptive father, William Kyle Riley. And the way he describes his father is fascinating from a purely organizational standpoint. He doesn't describe him as a mastermind. He describes him as a fixer.
A fixer in what sense? Like covering things up?
Well, more in the logistical sense. William Kyle Riley was a pilot. And according to The Sun, he could fly literally anything. Helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, single engines, corporate jets, If it had wings or rotors, he could move it.
And obviously, in the world of illicit trafficking, transportation is everything.
Precisely. You cannot move high-value assets, whether that's drugs, cash, or in this horrific case, children, on commercial flights. You need private, off-the-books transport.
So his dad was the transit guy.
Yeah, Riley says his father was the guy you called when you needed to move people discreetly. He explicitly calls his father a recruiter and a lower-level operator.
But there's a really interesting psychological dynamic there, too. Riley doesn't paint his father as the devil incarnate. He actually paints him as a coward.
That is a key distinction in the text. He says his father was absolutely terrified of the quote-unquote rich people. William Kyle Riley was a tough guy in his own right. Riley mentions he was a bare-knuckle brawler. But when it came to the bosses, he was totally subservient. He was an employee who was terrified of getting fired. Or worse.
Now contrast that with the mother.
Right, Mary Lynn Riley. And also, earlier on, a woman named Irene is mentioned. But Mary Lynn is the primary antagonist in the home. Riley's description of her is chilling because it completely lacks that element of fear that the father had. He describes her as overtly sadistic.
He actually argues she was more evil than the father, right?
She does.
Yeah.
He says she was more evil because she genuinely enjoyed the torture.
So the father did it for money, or out of fear of the bosses, but the mother did it for pleasure.
That is Riley's assessment of it, yes. He describes a woman who derived real satisfaction from the pain of the children she was supposedly raising. And just for the record, the notes indicate she died recently. It was a suicide in 2018, involving an overdose and alcohol.
So the parents are the ground level operators. They are the supply chain and the logistics. But who were they supplying? This is where the narrative shifts from a domestic horror story to a massive political conspiracy. Because usually when we hear the words trafficking ring and rich people, one specific name sucks all the oxygen out of the room. Jeffrey Epstein.
Right. And if this were just a fabricated story designed to get clicks by playing into current internet theories, you would fully expect Riley to say that Epstein was the kingpin who ran everything. Yeah. But he doesn't say that at all.
What does he say about Epstein?
He describes Epstein merely as a general manager, a coordinator.
That is a massive corporate demotion compared to how the media usually portrays him.
It really is. In Riley's structure, Epstein was just the face. He handled the logistics, the bookings, organizing the quote-unquote talent. But he wasn't the CEO. Riley alleges that the actual authority, the people giving the final orders, were a group of 6 to 8 super rich guys. And at the very top of that list, he names Donald Trump.
He explicitly places Trump above Epstein in the hierarchy.
Yes. He describes a rigid structure where Epstein essentially worked for Trump and this small cabal. They were the clients and the owners simultaneously. Epstein was just staff.
That completely flips the accepted narrative, and the location of these events plays heavily into this too. We are so used to hearing about the island, Little St. James. But Riley isn't talking about the Caribbean.
No, he isn't. He is talking about the American South. Specifically, rural farms in Tennessee and Alabama.
Farms? That feels so disconnected from the billionaire jet set image.
It does. But it makes perfect logistical sense if you think about privacy. Large tracts of land, private dirt roads, no close neighbors to hear screams or notice planes landing on private grass strips. Riley describes the atmosphere at these massive gatherings as being like a fair.
A fair? Like with cotton candy and rides?
Twisted, but yes, essentially. He mentions massive tents set up in fields, live bands playing music, and bare-knuckle fighting rings. He says that as a child, he was actually forced to participate in these fights for the entertainment of the guests. It was treated as a spectacle.
That sounds almost surreal, like some dystopian movie.
It does sound surreal, but it also aligns with the kind of depravity that often comes with completely unchecked power. Boredom is a powerful motivator for the ultra-wealthy. Riley says these parties wouldn't just be an evening, they would last for days.
And the text breaks down how the crowd would change over those days.
Right. The first few days might be what they considered mild, lots of drugs, some fighting, general debauchery, but then the larger crowd would thin out. The regular guests would go home.
Leaving what he calls the inner circle.
Exactly. A core group of 8 to 10 people would remain behind at the farm. Riley says this is when the truly horrible shit happened. The organized torture. The murders.
Okay, we need to go there now. We have to talk about the specific allegations against Donald Trump. Because Riley doesn't just casually say he was there, he describes a personality profile that is incredibly specific. Monster is the word he uses.
He uses monster very specifically to describe someone who takes deep enjoyment in pain. Riley claims that unlike some of the other men who were there strictly for sex, Trump was there for the dominance and the raw suffering.
There's a story in the transcripts about puppies, and I have to admit I struggle to even read this part of the text.
It's what he calls the break-in story. Riley says his first vivid memory of Trump was when Riley was about 8 or 9 years old. He claims Trump took an entire litter of puppies and systematically killed them right in front of him.
Systematically?
Yes, snapping their necks, cutting them open, holding them underwater. Riley believes this was not just random cruelty, it was a calculated test, a psychological conditioning technique. They wanted to see if the child would break, if he would cry, or if he would dissociate entirely. It was about establishing absolute total control through trauma.
And he says this animal abuse was a precursor to what was eventually done to him.
Yes. Riley recounts being sexually assaulted by Trump multiple times. But what stands out most in his memory is the strangulation. He says Trump would choke him until he passed out. He directly quotes Trump saying, "I really thought I killed you that time."
Which implies the goal wasn't even the assault itself. It was the near-death experience.
Riley interprets it exactly that way. He believes Trump got a massive rush from seeing the light go out in the victim's eyes. It was about having the ultimate power over life and death.
Now, there is an incident that Riley describes in graphic, mechanical detail. He calls it the tent peg incident. And I'd have to play devil's advocate for a second here, because we are talking about a child, a 12 or 13-year-old boy, overpowering a grown adult man. How is that even plausible?
That is the exact question. Volding seems to be turning over in his head during the chat. But Riley's account is highly specific about the physical mechanics of it. He says he had reached a breaking point where he firmly believed he was going to be murdered that night anyway. He felt he had absolutely nothing to lose.
That cornered animal survival instinct.
Right. He describes finding a heavy wooden tent stake in the room. Remember, they're at this fair environment with large tents outside. He says he prepared the stake, he put a condom on it. And during the assault, when Trump was physically positioned in a vulnerable way, Riley says he impaled him anally with the wooden stake and then kicked it in as hard as he physically could.
He actively tried to kill him.
He says in the transcript, "I tried to kill that son of a bitch." And medically speaking, an injury exactly like that, a blunt wooden stake driven violently into the rectum and potentially perforating the bowel, is catastrophic. It would cause massive internal bleeding and severe sepsis if not treated immediately in an operating room.
And Riley claims this actually happened.
He claims Trump had to be life-flighted out of the farm, an emergency medical evacuation via helicopter. And Riley speculates, and we should note this is his own theory, that the permanent physical damage from this specific injury is the real reason behind the long-standing rumors of Trump's incontinence or diaper usage. He argues it is not from drug use. He claims it is a direct result of a physical injury from roughly 1990.
Now, as an analyst, that is a falsifiable claim. If there was a medevac flight from a rural farm in Tennessee or Alabama carrying a high-profile New York real estate mogul in the early 90s, there would be a flight log. There would be a hospital admission record somewhere.
Exactly. It's a massive breadcrumb. This is something investigators can actually look for.
But Riley didn't walk away from that incident unscathed. You don't nearly kill the boss of a trafficking ring and just get a slap on the wrist.
No, absolutely not. The retaliation was brutal. He was told he had incurred a massive debt. Because he damaged the merchandise, or rather damaged the top client, he was forced to pay for it.
How does a child possibly pay a debt like that?
With his body. He describes being taken to a completely different location and passed around to a group of 25 to 40 men. He says by that point it wasn't even about sex anymore. It was pure punishment. They beat him, they assaulted him, and they systematically tried to break him.
And this leads us directly to the other political names mentioned in the text. Ixie says that during this prolonged punishment phase, he was handed over to specific individuals. And one of the names he drops is Andy Biggs.
Yes, Andy Biggs, the politician. Riley alleges that Biggs was basically given free rein. He was allowed to do whatever he wanted to the boy.
And the text describes a beating that nearly killed him.
He details suffering broken ribs and going into severe convulsions. He actually calls it the death rattle. He remembers lying on the floor, totally unable to breathe, and hearing his father, the man who facilitated all of this, actually screaming at Biggs.
His father intervened in the beating.
Riley claims his father yelled, "I didn't say you could fucking kill him."
That provides such a disturbing insight into the father's mindset. There was a line drawn, but the line wasn't about protecting his son from harm. The line was simply, don't permanently break the asset.
Exactly. It was a property dispute over damaged goods. And Riley says he remembers Biggs specifically because on the car ride to that location, the name was repeated over and over by the adults in the car.
Yeah.
Biggs, Andy Biggs. He made a very conscious effort to memorize that name through the haze of pain.
It is so interesting how trauma memory works. Some things are a complete blur, but other specific sensory details are crystal clear.
That is a classic hallmark of post-traumatic stress. The brain records high stress, life or death moments in extreme high definition. And that directly applies to the Jim Jordan allegation too.
Tell us about that part of the transcript, because the physical details he provides there are very visual.
Riley places Jim Jordan at one of these farm parties when Riley was about 12 years old. He describes a very specific wrestling-style assault happening in front of a crowd of 25 to 50 people.
A wrestling-style assault? Which obviously tracks with Jordan's well-known background.
It does. Riley makes a point to explain to Volding that his father had taught him how to box, so he knew how to throw a punch and defend himself striking. But he did not know how to grapple. He claims Jordan rushed him, tackled him, and pinned him to the ground using wrestling techniques.
But Jim Jordan would have been very young back then, right? If Riley was 12.
Yes, and that is the specific detail that makes Riley's account so interesting to analyze. He notes that Jordan stood out to him precisely because he was much, much younger than the other men in the room. He puts him at roughly college age at the time. And he specifically mentions his jawline. He says in the chat, "I'd know that jawline anywhere," along with recognizing his distinct voice later.
So he is essentially describing a young Jim Jordan being initiated into this elite circle.
Which implies there was a grooming process for the perpetrators just as much as there was for the victims. The older bosses bring them in young, they compromise them with heinous acts, and then they completely own them for life.
Now, the transcript mentions other names too. Lindsey Graham, Clarence Thomas. But Riley treats those names very differently than Trump, Biggs, or Jordan. He does not accuse them of the same things.
And honestly, this is where Riley's overall credibility gets a significant boost from an analytical standpoint. If he were just making up a politically motivated hit list to destroy his enemies, he would naturally accuse every single one of them of the absolute worst possible crimes. But he stops short.
What exactly does he say about Graham and Thomas?
He says very clearly that he cannot swear under oath that Graham or Thomas physically assaulted him. He refuses to lie about it just to make the story bigger. He does place them at the parties, though. He says he remembers Graham's voice and what he calls effeminate mannerisms, which his father apparently mocked. And he remembers Thomas standing out simply because he was the only black man in what Riley describes as a white folks club.
So he places them at the scene of these crimes, but explicitly not participating in the violence.
Correct. Though he does recall his father celebrating Clarence Thomas's Supreme Court confirmation years later, viewing it as having a crucial buffer in a very high place. But Riley is incredibly careful to distinguish between, "I saw them in the room, and they physically hurt me."
He also briefly mentions Vladimir Putin, right?
Yes, but again, very carefully. Putin is mentioned as a name he heard the adults discussing back in the 1980s. They referred to him as an important foreigner. But Riley clarifies, he never personally saw Putin at these events.
Let's shift gears entirely. We have spent a lot of time deconstructing the perpetrators and the structure of the ring, but we really need to talk about the victims. Riley was not the only child trapped in this.
No, he wasn't. And frankly, this is the part of the transcript that is the hardest to read, but we have to cover it. We have to say their names. Riley talks at length about a group they called the Three Musketeers.
Who are Three Musketeers?
There were three young girls he was trafficked alongside: Samantha, Patricia, and Sarah. They formed an incredibly tight bond. Trauma bonding is a very real, very powerful psychological phenomenon. In that absolute hell, they became each other's only family.
Let's go through their stories individually based on the text. Who was Sarah?
Sarah was a girl who just reached her absolute breaking point. Riley describes her eventual suicide, but it wasn't a solitary act. She was physically and mentally unable to endure the torture for one more day, but she couldn't bring herself to physically pull the trigger. So she asked Samantha to help her.
Oh my God, one severely traumatized child asking another child to help her die.
And Samantha did it. Riley describes it not as a murder, but as a desperate act of mercy. He talks about how he and Samantha then had to frantically clean up the blood afterwards so the adults wouldn't see the mess and punish them further. Just try to imagine the psychological weight of scrubbing your friend's blood off the floor as a child.
And what happened to Patricia?
Patricia's death was a straight execution. Riley describes being locked in a bedroom with her. Men suddenly burst into the room. He assumes they were security or handlers. They brutally assaulted her, and then they shot her in the head right in front of him.
Why do it right in front of him?
It was a message. Riley claims this execution was done right before Donald Trump entered the bedroom. It was a theatrical way of saying, if you fight me, if you resist what is about to happen, this is exactly what happens to you. It was pure psychological terror designed to ensure absolute compliance.
And then there's Samantha Jackson.
Samantha was an African-American runaway. Riley says his parents, Mary Lynn specifically, tortured her relentlessly for weeks. He describes her suffering as incredibly prolonged and deeply targeted.
And how does the text describe her death?
In the end, much like Sarah, she begged Riley to end it. She couldn't take another hour of the torture. She begged him to strangle her. And he admits, completely on the record to Volding in this chat, that he did it. He ended her life with his own hands to save her from his mother's sadism.
That is just... there are almost no words for a reality like that.
He tells Volding, I did for Sammy what Sammy did for Sarah. It is a horrifying moral calculus that no human being should ever be forced to make, let alone a child.
Now what happened to all these bodies? You have multiple dead children at these farms. Where do they go?
This is where the grim class dynamics of the trafficking ring really come into focus. Riley talks about groups of locals. He calls them hillbillies or country boys. Men who weren't rich, who weren't powerful politicians, but who knew the local land intimately.
The disposal crew.
Exactly. They handled the graves. He quotes one of these men saying something that perfectly sums up the entire twisted operation. The man told him, girls are a dime a dozen, boys are hard to find. They viewed these girls as entirely disposable commodities. Use them up, throw them away in a ditch, and just get new ones.
It really paints a picture of a fully integrated, tiered ecosystem. The billionaires fly in on the private jets, do their damage, and fly out. The parents facilitate the logistics, and the locals clean up the physical mess left behind.
A complete ecosystem of abuse. And Riley mentions snuff films as part of this economy too. He claims he was forced to participate in films where girls were actually killed on camera, which implies that somewhere out there is a hard video record of these murders.
And that brings us to the most critical question of this entire deep dive. The question that every skeptical listener is naturally asking right now. Is there proof? Is there a paper trail? Because graphic allegations are one thing, but verifiable evidence is another entirely.
Riley and Volding spent a huge amount of their chat logs discussing exactly this. They know perfectly well that without hard corroboration, this will just be dismissed as another internet conspiracy theory. And there are two main pillars of physical evidence they focus on.
Let's start with the Fort Carson military investigation. This happened much later, when Riley was an adult serving in the Army, correct?
Right. This would have been around 2008 to roughly 2010. Riley was actively serving at Fort Carson. He says he was suddenly called in by his chain of command. And he names specific names for the record. First Sergeant Michael R. Bayless and Captain Ryan L. Mendenhall.
Why did his command call him in?
It wasn't about any infraction Riley committed. The military police had caught another soldier, a Staff Sergeant Habel, with child pornography. When the investigators looked at the digital files found on Habel's computer, they recognized one of the victims.
They recognized the child in the pornographic films as their own active-duty soldier, Riley.
Yes. Riley has a very distinctive face, and perhaps specific scars, but they positively made the match. They called him into the office and showed him the printed images.
And how did he react?
He owned it immediately. He looked at them and said, yes, when I was a child, I had to do those things.
Now that is a massive piece of verifiable data. A formal military investigation generates paperwork. There would be a record of Staff Sergeant Habel's court-martial or administrative discharge. There would be a sworn statement or an interview record with Riley.
Exactly. If that specific investigative file can be unsealed, or if those named officers can be formally deposed under oath, it mathematically proves that the films exist. It proves Riley was the verified victim in them. It moves the needle permanently from wild story to established fact.
And the second pillar of evidence, the hospital records.
This one is arguably even more important for establishing the timeline of the allegations. Riley talks about a specific stay at a behavioral hospital called Charter Woods in Alabama. This was in 1989.
He was just a young child then.
Yes. And he claims that during his intensive therapy sessions there, he mentioned Donald Trump by name. He talked to the therapist about the man from New York who killed the puppies.
In 1989, Trump was obviously a famous celebrity, but he was absolutely not a polarizing political figure. He wasn't running for president.
Correct. If there's a medical transcript sitting in a basement from 1989 where a deeply traumatized boy in rural Alabama is naming Donald Trump as his violent abuser, that completely destroys the argument that this is just a politically motivated lie invented in 2025 to affect an election. You cannot fake a 35-year-old hospital admission record, or at least it is virtually impossible to do convincingly.
So moving to part 6 of our outline, the now. What is actually happening with Riley and Volding right now in July 2025?
They are in a desperate race. They feel the walls closing in on them. Volding is trying to organize all this chaotic, traumatic memory into a coherent, structured testimony for the ICC. They explicitly state in behind them have way too much control over the DOJ and the FBI. Riley says flat out that if he walks into an FBI or international circles in Europe.
And practically speaking, on the ground, what is Riley doing today?
He is physically prepping a go bag. Passport, social security card, original birth certificate. He mentions he is just waiting on a part to fix his motorcycle so he can make a fast, off-the-radar run down to Alabama.
To get the Charter Woods hospital record.
Exactly. He wants to physically retrieve his own medical file before the hospital purges it or someone else makes it disappear. It sounds like a spy novel scenario, but it is his very real, very dangerous reality right now.
And Volding gives him some very specific advice regarding the media during this prep phase.
Yet Volding urgently warns him, do not talk to any journalists yet. He specifically mentions avoiding certain outlets like the Christian Daily and Allen Analysis.
Why avoid the press? You would think they would want as much massive publicity as possible to protect themselves.
They want strictly controlled publicity. Volding is terrified that if Riley talks to the wrong journalist, the story will be immediately spun. Or that small snippets will be released out of context, allowing the accused politicians to muddy the waters and discredit him before the full, heavy evidence is presented to a court. They want to drop the raw audio, the unvarnished truth, on their own terms first.
Reading the end of these transcripts, Riley seems to have a very fatalistic, almost grim outlook on his own survival.
He really does. He tells Volding he doesn't want money. He doesn't care about a lucrative book deal or a movie rights contract. He only wants justice. He uses a phrase that really stuck with me. He says, exposing this ring is the only way to stop the goose-stepping towards our own crematorium.
Goose-stepping towards our own crematorium. That directly links his deep personal trauma to a very stark political warning for the country.
It does. He clearly sees the sadism he experienced in those farm bedrooms as the exact same sadism that drives the political ideology of the men he is accusing. He views them as fundamentally broken, highly dangerous men who are now essentially running the country or attempting to.
Fangs forward, faith up. That is his personal motto mentioned in the text.
It is a total warrior's mantra. Fangs forward, meaning always be ready to violently fight for your life. Faith up, meaning hope for ultimate survival or justice. It perfectly captures the duality of his existence. He's a profoundly broken victim, but he's also a highly trained soldier.
So we need to wrap this up. We have thrown a massive amount of intense information at you today. We have a witness with a verified, extensive military background. We have highly specific, falsifiable allegations regarding medical medevac flights and locked hospital records. And we have a horrific, detailed narrative of child trafficking involving the absolute highest levels of wealth and power.
And we also have the tragic reality of the Three Musketeers. We cannot let ourselves forget them in all the political noise. If this story is true, then Samantha, Patricia, and Sarah were real human beings who were brutally murdered. Achieving justice for them is just as vital as addressing the massive accusations against the politicians.
The ball is entirely in the court of the investigators now. Can Volding successfully navigate international law and get this to the ICC? Can Riley manage to get down to Alabama on his motorcycle and back alive with the evidence?
And honestly, can the general public even handle the truth if it all comes out? That is the real lingering question. If those Charter Woods papers are actually found, if that Fort Carson file is ripped open, the structural implications for society are country-breaking.
We will definitely be watching this closely, and we will be waiting for more of these raw transcripts to be analyzed as they come out, because this really feels like it is just the tip of a very dark iceberg.
I fear you are entirely right about that.
And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. If those records at Charter Woods have indeed sat dormant and ignored since 1989, How many other hospital basements, how many other forgotten therapy logs across the country hold similar buried confessions from other traumatized children? How many pieces of the puzzle are just waiting in cardboard boxes for someone to finally look at them?
It's a terrifying thought.
It is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It was a very hard one to get through, but looking away doesn't make these things go away. Take care of yourselves.